Hello, and welcome to the Surgical Assistant Podcast, a podcast crafted by surgical assistants for surgical assistants, where professionalism meets passion. Welcome, everybody, to the Surgical Assistant Podcast. I'm John.
I'm Kelly.
Hey, Kelly, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. So we're having this special episode that we're launching this week for Surgical Assistant Week. As you know, it's the 14th through the 18th of April. And we thought we'd kick this special episode off. We have a really good guest this week. Many of you will know him, and I don't want to say who it is because you'll see it when we launch the podcast. But we just thought we'd go into a little bit about, Surgical Assistant Week and maybe a little bit about the history of surgical assistants. And speaking of surgical assistants, this is the month of April. So our conference, the joint conference, the ASA Joint Conference is going to be in Grapevine, Texas, the 25th and 26th of this month. So I'm looking forward to that. Kelly and I will be there. Looking forward to the two hands-on workshops. Those will be great. They're doing one on the Venapax endovascular harvesting, and then the second one is on the Ross procedure. Those are going to be really good hands-on. And then I haven't seen the final agenda yet, though, for the conference, but it's going to be coming out soon, so I'm looking forward to that. And you guys can check with the ASA or the NSAA and keep an eye on your inbox. They'll send it out once the agenda is finalized. But I was thinking today about, surgical assistants and what it's like. I mean, I love what I do, and I'm so grateful. This is all I've ever wanted to do from the first time I saw my first surgery. I became a surgical tech, and then I wanted to go further. But as you'll see with our guest this week, it's been said that in order to know where you're going, you need to know where you've come from. And we've been handed this gift by all the surgical assistants that have come before us. And some of the things I learned about what those guys did to further the agenda of surgical assistants is just amazing. The self-sacrificing that they did, even using their own money at some point to push legislation, it's mind-blowing. But so I started doing some research on surgical assistant programs. When I wanted to become a surgical assistant, there were only 7 KHEP accredited surgical assistant programs throughout the country. Now there's 13, which I'm glad to see. More people can become surgical assistants who are interested in it. And I know that there are some legacy schools that have run surgical assistant programs. I worked recently in the state of Virginia, and in Virginia, they have the Eastern Virginia Medical School, who has a master's level surgical assistant program, which I believe was started in the middle to late 70s. And then the Mayo Clinic has a master's level surgical assisting program. I'm not exactly sure when theirs started. But what I was able to find out and what I had known for a while is that the very first surgeon's assistant program was started at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. So it was started by a guy named John Webster Kirkland, who was a cardiothoracic surgeon. He was a pioneer in cardiac surgery. In fact, he had modified the Mayo Gibbons heart-lung machine to work and had performed some of the first series of bypasses at the Mayo Clinic. He was born in Muncie, Indiana. At the age of 8, they moved to Rochester, Minnesota, because his father was recruited by the Mayo Clinic to be a radiologist there. And he did his undergraduate at the University of Minnesota and then went to Harvard Medical School. And in, 1943, he started his residency back at the Mayo Clinic. And in 1944, he was inducted into the military, into the Army, and learned military neurosurgery. And then when he stopped in 1946, and then went back to his residency program and became a surgeon. In the 1950s, he completed his residency. And in the mid-1950s, is when he modified the Gibbons heart-lung machine. And it became known as the Mayo Gibbons heart-lung machine. And he was made professor of surgery at the Mayo Clinic in 1960. In 1964, he became department of the chair in surgery. And then in 1966, he was recruited by the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And he had such a successful and storied career at the University at Rochester, Minnesota, at the Mayo Clinic. They asked him why he wanted to leave, and he said, because I don't want to spend the last 15 years of my career doing what I did for the first 15 years of my career. And he was a pretty interesting man. I believe when he was in college, he met his wife, who was also a physician. She was an internal medicine doctor. In fact, I have it written down here. She went to the University of Buffalo. She was one of 6 women in her medical school class out of 60 people. And she was a doctor of internal medicine. And she helped him when Dr. Kirtland got to the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He started a surgeon's assistant program because he thought that surgeons, while there may be enough in the country, they were regionalized and they weren't. Specialties were sporadically spread out through the country. It was disparate. And he thought you could train competent people to take over some of the duties of what a physician would do, because he felt some surgeons and some specialties were task saturated. So in some specialties, surgical assistants could really help. And he was instrumental in pushing that program forward. So he started a training program at the University of Alabama, Birmingham in 1967, he and his wife both. And it was revolutionary at the time. Number one, just because of the format of it, but also in reading, I found out that in the first class in 1967, there were a total of, I think, 4 students, 2 of which were women, and 2 of those 4 students were minorities. So they were pretty progressive back then. And his wife eventually was innovative in teaching the program and helped establish that program. So, and in 1974, they received accreditation by another agency, which I'm blanking on the name of at the moment, in collaboration with the American Colleges of Surgeons. So through my research, I found that the University of Alabama, Birmingham had the first surgeon's assistant program, which is now, I believe, a physician assistant program with a emphasis in surgery. When I first found out about it was in 1984, and I had the brochure and everything in the application. I was going to apply. I wanted to go because I read it, and it was still then, at that time, it was called a surgeon's assistant program, and it was strictly perioperative, doing what we do today. And it was people like that came before us, and a pioneer like Dr. Kirkland, who had the foresight to see a role for us, that there is a designated role of the assistant at the surgical field, and to be progressive enough and open-minded enough to think that you can use a non-physician, a specially trained non-physician for that. That's how we got to the field. And naturally, a lot of us come from that surgical background. Either we were nurses, we were surgical techs, we were any one of different perioperative roles that saw that role at the field and wanted to do it, and then got the education to do it. And I'm grateful for people like our guest this week, who was a pioneer in that and who really pushed the ball forward, and other people, the people that founded the various schools, like Dennis Stover at Meridian, and all the people that came before us, Karen Ludwig, the people that really pushed hard to get that book on surgical assisting published, the early board members of the ASA and NSAA. I mean, we really owe where we are to them today, and I'm excited to see that. And I always look forward to the conferences when I get to see those people and the people that are actively on the board today, because while they don't get paid for that, it's still a huge sacrifice of their time and energy. And I'm just grateful for people who choose to do that. So all the time and energy it takes to put on the conferences, because that's no easy task. And then trying to make a group of people happy is never easy, especially a bunch of type A personalities like ourselves. But so that's pretty what I have on the history of surgical assisting. I do know that in Britain, it started with the surgical nurses in Britain, and it goes all the way back to the Crimean War. And they featured prominently in non-physician surgical assistant roles. So there's definitely a historical precedent for us and our role. And I think that it's just going to only increase as we go forward. Just in my professional career, from a surgical tech onto a surgical assistant, I've seen it change. I've seen more and more job openings. I've seen more states adopt the use of surgical assistants where I didn't see it before. So I just think it's going to keep going that way, and hopefully we'll keep plugging away and pushing for legislation in these other states, and we'll continue to move the ball forward. So that's what I got. Kelly, you have anything you'd like to add?
Absolutely. Thank you, John, for that thorough history of the first surgical assisting program that you know about, and a little bit of that history about how our profession came to be. So many
Mhm.
pioneers that came before us, and, establishing this very niche and specific career that we now have the privilege of working in is so interesting to learn about. And I wanted to just tag on to what you said, that in 1992, the Kirkland Clinic of UAB opened at UAB Hospital in 1992. And so, having lived in Alabama and central Alabama for 3 decades almost of my life, I was very familiar with the Kirkland Clinic. I mean, at UAB, it's very notorious and well known. A lot of people go there for highly specialized care and whatnot. It's just a very well known, and renowned place in Alabama and in the states around there. But knowing now where the name Kirkland came from, like, I just learned that from you. I was like, oh, I sat here and Googled the Kirkland Clinic. I'm like, oh, that's the Kirkland Clinic, like, that I know. But yeah, it says
Yes.
it houses hundreds of physicians in nearly 36 specialties.
Hmm.
up there at the Kirkland Clinic. So that's kind of the go-to place if you live in the southeastern region there. It's one of the premier go-to places for medical and surgical care, specialty care as well. So now we know that that history of who that was named after is so interesting to know that. And that just segues us into the celebration of Surgical Assisting Week
Hmm.
as we're going into this newly formed week. I think has it been 3 or 4 years now that it was kind of created, the week celebrating surgical assistants. And we are so excited to have our guest on this week,
Hmm.
or this episode, because he is who I consider one of the veterans and pioneers of this profession. And getting to talk to him and ask him questions and hearing his answers, we had so much light shed on really some things that we were just ignorant to about, how legislation comes in and plays a role and those kind of things. And as you listen to the interview, you're going to see and hopefully appreciate, like we did, where how it took people kind of beating down that path for us. And it also inspires me to want to do that for people coming behind us, John, because we're, coming to a time in our life that we have the opportunity to pass the baton on and teach others younger than us. And it's one reason why we started this podcast. We want to influence and we want to teach and build up and encourage those professionals coming alongside us. It's just really have been enlightening to talk to this guest that we have. So, in celebrating Surgical Assistant Week, I do want to talk a little bit about. I kind of wish we could have an interactive discussion with some of our listeners and discussing, how your hospital or how your operating room celebrates Surgical Assistant Week. And I know, we feel inundated from all the celebration weeks that we have for different OR professionals. But I want to encourage you, if you're listening today, and as we kick off this week, and we're going to release this episode as the week is starting off, I want to encourage you to, promote yourself. Don't be the person that complains that management isn't recognizing First Assistance Week, or it's newly formed. It's new, and a lot of managers don't know, or directors, or whoever your charge nurse is, they don't know about it. Number one. So be that person that educates and informs, and don't be ashamed to promote yourself. And just, even if it's just like, it's Surgical Assistant Week, and I'm so thankful that I get to be a surgical assistant in this operating room. So it's so easy to get sucked into being negative and, kind of jumping on that bandwagon of, nobody likes me, everybody hates me, think I'll go eat worms. We all have days like that in the operating room where we feel like we're just out here doing our best and nobody's recognizing us. Sometimes it's a thankless job. Our patient's asleep. Everybody's in there. We're in the trenches together. I used that term this week, John. I've had I've had a couple of weeks at work. It's been busy, or we've had some kind of tricky situations in the operating room, and things that we don't like to deal with, but happen. And I have used that term this week with some people that I work with. I'm like, hey, we've been in the trenches together. Like, we're here, we're trudging it out. I mean, it's not fun, but we're all in it together, and we're going to help this patient, and we're trying to get do the best thing for our patient that we can. And so, just be positive and promote yourself if you have to. Buy cupcakes one day, bring donuts in, bring lunch in, or promote yourself if you have to. But we just want to wish everyone a happy First Assistance Week, and celebrate yourself, celebrate your accomplishments in the profession, celebrate your role in the operating room, and carry yourself in such a way that you earn the respect that is given to you. And it'll be a fun week. It'll be good to just even recognize. But this episode, I feel like, John, really helps us, in the interview that we were able to do, is going to help us turn our focus backwards, and kind of give us some insight and understanding into how this profession came to be and why we're here doing it in the first place. And also, we talk about going forward. What are some things that we can look forward to? And so, yeah, so I'm just excited about it. I'm excited about this episode, and about celebrating the coming week.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Kelly. And you brought up an interesting point that I wanted to dovetail with, especially about Dr. Kirkland. I mean, the guy was a pioneer and he believed a lot of things. One thing he believed and he promoted in his operating was a calm, serene environment, because he felt that if everybody was calm and serene, that they had the more mental energy to improvise in a crisis. And when you also
Mm.
said earlier about we're relatively newcomers in the profession in this, and it's still up to us. I mean, and one thing I try to do, and I'm not always good at it though, is I may be the only surgical assistant that somebody ever sees, a surgeon or whatever, and therefore I want to best represent, the all of the good points of a surgical assistant, and that a surgeon will remember me and I'll be like, yeah, that was really help. I'm glad we had help with that surgery. And one thing that Dr. Kirkland was a stickler about for himself and his residents and his students was to look professional. No
Mm-hmm.
matter what time of the day, no matter how tired you were, he could finish a long, very long cardiac surgery. And before he talked to family, he would make sure his hair was combed, he was shaved, he would put on a freshly starched lab coat, because he believed that reassured his patients, it reassured his patient's family, and
Mm-hmm.
instilled confidence, because he thought if you came out of the operating room to talk to a family and you were disheveled and your scrubs had stains on it, then that would provoke anxiety, number one, in your patient, and number two, in your patient's family. And they wouldn't have trust in you to do the job. And I remember reading a study a bunch of years ago that Tom Scalia did at Shock Trauma in Maryland, that if a patient believes in their surgeon, they do so much better, rather than a person who was fearful of his surgeon or didn't think
Absolutely.
their
Yeah.
surgeon lacked skills, that, yeah, they didn't do as well. So, but yes, I'm so grateful for this profession, and I'm so grateful for those that came before us that have handed us this. And now it's our opportunity to nurture it and move the ball forward. So I'm grateful to everybody that's the past board members, current board members, past presidents, current presidents, future presidents, even. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I think this is a perfect week because within striking distance of the week, we're going to have the surgical assistant conference. And I highly urge everybody to go. You should go at least once, because there's so much more to a surgical assistant conference than you can ever imagine. If you just think it's for CEUs, you're missing out on the major part of it. Yes, there is an expense to it. And yes, I do believe it is tax deductible because it's a professional expense. But however, if you're going to be a professional and we want to be recognized as professionals, it's there's a cost to it. But what you get back is far more than what you give out. I mean, the hands-on classes alone are worth the price of admission to me. Yes, there's an extra cost for those, but it's not just for the CEUs. I mean, the knowledge I've gained from those has been invaluable. Even though I don't do cardiac surgery, I don't know if I'll ever do cardiac surgery. That endovascular harvesting course doesn't give you a certificate to harvest vein, but it's an introduction to it. So people are maybe thinking about moving forward into cardiac surgery and wonder if they like it. It's a good opportunity to see and learn, because if you can learn, you can support it. Maybe you're a first assistant in cardiac surgery, but the PA's harvest vein. But now you have a better idea of what's going on, what's needed, and you can facilitate that. So I think it's just great. But I love this profession. I can't see myself doing anything else. And I'm so grateful for those that came before us, going all the way back to Robert Liston and those guys,
Mm-hmm.
and through the pioneers of cardiac surgery. I mean, Dr. Kirkland wrote one of the current textbooks. What does it say? He wrote and edited a current standard textbook in cardiac surgery. So I didn't know enough about the Kirkland Clinic to bring it up, but that's weird. I'm glad that you actually knew of that clinic, and that
Yeah.
is a famous clinic, because he was an amazing. He and his wife are amazing. I mean, the more I read about them, the more I learn. And you guys can go to the UAB website. There's a physician assistant history website that is attached to them, that you can learn all about this, read all about the program, and the early, founders of it, some of the early students and how they pushed it forward. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm really grateful. So Kelly, if you don't have anything else, that's all I got.
Yeah,
And
that's
then
it.
we'll
We want to
just,
kick it. Yeah, we want to kick it over to our interview this week and let people get started on that. So that's going to add a little time onto this week's episode, but we wanted to
Mhm.
come on and kind of give this little update about the week and just kind of encourage you all to listen to this episode with that, keeping all that in mind, the history and the future of first assisting and how excited we are about it. And yeah, we hope you enjoy listening.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly. It's because of people like our guests that we are where we are today. And I'm grateful for
Mm-hmm.
their sacrifice in their time, money, energy, and everything. So it's our guest and his peers of that time that really put us on the map for where we are today. And now it's up to us to not screw it up and keep it going forward.
Right, that's right.
So, yep. So we'll just segue into our episode, and thanks for joining us. And we hope you like the episode. Don't forget
Yeah.
to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you don't mind leaving us a review somewhere. Maybe if you go to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review, that would really help the algorithms pick us up and get this out to other people who would be interested in hearing it. So, but we appreciate the word of mouth and whatever you guys do to promote the podcast. We're truly humbled for the response we're seeing. And we're going to keep trying to get better and present more things you like. So please leave us a comment. Shoot us an email at thesurgicalassistantpodcast@gmail.com if you have any ideas or questions.
Yep, absolutely. We look forward to hearing from you. Enjoy, everybody.
Take care. Enjoy the Surgical Assistant Conference. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to the Surgical Assisting Podcast. I'm John.
I'm Kelly.
Hey, Kelly. And today we have a special guest with us. Fred Fisher is are you the current president of the ASA or past president?
Current.
He's the current president of the Association of Surgical Assistants. I first met Fred at my first conference when I became a surgical assistant back in 2015. He was incredibly helpful, incredibly generous. Back then, I think myself, like most new surgical assistants, were thinking about becoming independent. And I had talked to him about that, and I really wasn't sure where to go. And he said, well, you need to use contracts, and I'll send you some of mine, and you can use those as a guide. And, I was surprised that they were in my inbox before the end of the day. It was fantastic. So I thought he'd be a great person to have on to talk about the history of our profession, what he's seen in the years that he's been an assistant, and where he sees our profession going. So with that, I'll kick it off to Fred. Do you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself? Like, how long have you been in SA or?
Sure. I was one of the old dinosaurs that got in the job trained,
Mhm.
And actually I was a certified surgical technologist, and the small hospital I was at in upstate New York, we'd assist also because back in the day, this was like 1987, and back in the day, the general practitioners would come in and assist the surgeons with their own patients. So that was the standard kind of back then. But, at night and on call and all this, I would always get called in to assist while there was another surgical technologist running the back table. So that's kind of where I got my start in 1987.
Okay. And what state was that in? Was that in Illinois or
That was upstate New York.
upstate New York? Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Kelly, did you want to ask any questions, or you just want to go back and
well,
forth?
I was hoping that Fred could tell us how he then progressed from there. You were a surgical technologist, and did you just continue to assist through all of those years?
No, I did assist, and then there weren't any real schools for surgical assisting. And in I think it was 88 or 89, there was a thing out of Colorado called Colorado Surgical Assisting Inc. And they put on suture workshops and wound closure workshops once a month around the country. So they had one in Buffalo, New York, and I signed up, and that really intrigued me. So I got involved in their program, and it was long distance, and then you had to go out to Denver for a week to do a hands-on lab, much like they are today. Only our labs were much more primitive back then than styrofoam dummies. But it was a great learning experience, and I learned a lot. And from there, I was on the job train. So back then, you could do a number of cases, with the couple letters from surgeons, et cetera, and sit for the CFFA exam. I did that, and about 5 months later, I took the NSAA exam, and I also took the ABSA exam back then. So I was certified by all three organizations at one time. I figured, hey, you can't go wrong.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to do the same thing.
Just hit them all.
So you
That's
said you were a
interesting.
surgical technologist.
Go ahead, John.
What made you become a surgical technologist? How did you get interested in that?
Well, I'd got out of high school and I went in the service, spent 10 years in the service, anything surgery related. I got out and I went to Elmira College and I was a biology major. And one of the nursing, and they had a nursing program, and she goes, "You might like the OR." So back then it was much easier to get into an OR than it is now without all the, you got to have TV, you got to have this, you got to have that. But she took me into an OR, and boy, oh boy, did I love it. She goes, "You just found yourself a home, didn't you?" She knew it right away before I did. So that's when I wanted to get into it. And there was a surgical technology program out here outside of Buffalo that I started. But I was married at the time, and then I was going through a divorce. And listen, man, financially, I wasn't able to swing it. So I had to drop out. But the OR director of this one small hospital in upstate New York took a chance on me. And boy, am I ever grateful for her, you know. And it worked out good for her, too.
That's wonderful.
That's kind of
Kelly.
my story to get into it.
Excellent. Kelly, did you want to ask a question?
That's awesome. I just wanted to say how, we sometimes underestimate how invaluable that on the job training is directly from the surgeons, because I know there's a lot of, peripheral training that takes place from those veteran nurses and veteran, OR staff that's been there. But to get that direct training from those surgeons to first assist them is invaluable. And of course, I value a formal education and formal training and structured training and all that. But how cool is it that, back in those days, that's just the way it was. You received a lot of that training directly from the surgeons, and how much you can learn, because even after graduating from, an FA program, the majority of my learning has come from the surgeons, so that's really cool that you got to start out like that. That's a great experience. I know
And
it's
it's funny because
lent you well.
after
Yeah.
I went to that suture workshop, so I get back there, and the surgeon, we did appendectomy, and he goes, "You can take off or you can close this wound for me, Fred." Hand shaking, first time,
Oh, yeah.
And but they went through a great deal of support for me, because back then at the hospital, the only assistant could be an MD. So they had to change all the medical bylaws. They had to do this. And then when I finished the Colorado surgical assistant, there was an anesthesia guy that was older, and he used to be head of the anesthesia group at Community Hospital in Syracuse, New York. So he says, "Now you got to go deal with administration about some pay, Fred." And at the time, I was getting, I think, $11.43 an hour. And I said, "Well, how much should I ask him?" He goes, "You ask him for $100,000. Now, this was 1988.
Oh, wow.
And boy, oh boy, I'm going, "Are you sure?" He says, "Yes, I'm sure. Have you ever dealt with administration?" I said, "No." So he kind of guided me in. So I went into hospital administration, and I said, he goes, "Well, how much money are we talking here, Fred?" I said, 100,000. I thought his eyes were going to bug out of his head. But the great news is 1988, we settled on $65,000, and with 2 weekends off. And that was a great amount of money back then. So I was very happy.
Oh, I can imagine. That's wonderful. Let's see. And that was 1989. Is that the same year you took your certification? When you got
Yes,
certified by all three bodies? Okay.
yeah.
So for
And
the people
back then, it was interesting because the ABSA had this show 'em you could suture. There was a written exam, but back then, an oral, a written, and a hands-on. So the oral, you had to go in a room, and on the board, they had 3 or 4 surgeries. You pick one, then that instructor that was in the air would ask you all sorts of questions about the surgery. Then they had to show them you knew how to suture and all this. That doesn't happen much anymore, but I mean, you had to prove that, you knew. And lucky I saw laparoscopic cholecystectomy out there. I'll
You
take
knew that
that.
one.
Wonderful. I had spoken to somebody and they told me about the early days of the ABSA and how you had I didn't know there was a hands-on portion, but that person did tell me that there was a written and an oral part to that, which that's a good idea for us, So at what year did you join the ASA, the Association of Surgical Assistants?
Same year it got started, I joined, and I think that was 10, 12 years ago when I was initially started. But before that, we had what AST would put on was they called them a surgical first assistant forums, where they were held around different parts of the country. And I got to speak and do a couple presentations to those, And it was funny because I worked with a guy in Illinois. I ended up working with this guy. And I didn't know he's a world-renowned hip and knee surgeon, Wayne Poprowski. And they use his hip classification system. And he also developed the extended trochanteric osteotomy, and he designed stems and everything. And I looked at back then you had to do a slideshow presentation, not in the PowerPoints or anything. And I did a slideshow presentation. And while I was unpacking some stuff, I found this slideshow presentation from 1997. And it was funny because I went through, and some of the cases we did were real messes. But then it was all distal fixation instead of, proximal like it is now. And it's interesting to look at the changes.
Yes, it is. So speaking of changes, when did you first get involved in the board of the Association of Surgical Assistants?
I've been on the board 2 terms as board of director. That's 4 years. 2 years as secretary, 4 years as secretary. That's 8, and it'll be 12 years.
That's fantastic.
4 years as a president.
Well, thank you for your dedication and service to the profession, and thank you for your service in the military as well. I appreciate that. What are some of the biggest changes you've seen in our profession over just your career?
I've seen the licensing and the registration in states, which is crucial for us to move forward in. And, I've seen the first assistant schools are getting more popular, and they're getting more and more, which is great because we really need those. And, and more people are getting involved, but you also, on the downside, you see hospitals now, because of the shortage, just training their own surgical techs and, using anybody to assist, and I know that's what's happening in Colorado. I've been involved out there, and boy, oh boy, it's a shame. But I think pushing forward that we will be able to show with the educational standards and formal training programs that, we have the right to be there just as well as an RNFA or a PA.
That's true. I agree. That's one thing I've seen. It just in my career, I started as a surgical technologist in 1992, and my experience was much the same as yours, Fred, that when I first started, managed care had just taken over. So it used to be, like you said, 2 surgeons, 1 primary, 1 assistant, and they assisted each other. And then when managed care came in and they stopped reimbursing for that, then that went down. And where I started in Florida, first assistants really weren't recognized. I knew 1, but I'm back in Florida now, and I've kept up with it as you have. And we know SAs that work in Florida. Every hospital pretty much uses them now, which I think is fantastic. But you're right, we do need more programs. When I first wanted to become an SA, I think there were 7 KHEP accredited programs, and now there's 13. There was 12 because Stark State had their program went defunct, but then I heard one just opened up in Idaho. So that I think that brings us back up to 13 again. So I think that's fantastic.
And it's wonderful, you know. It was wonderful because I know you do the travel gig a lot, John.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, in 1993, I was at a small hospital. So I ended up helping Colorado surgical assisting teach these wound closures and suturing workshops around the country once a month. And they said, well, why don't you come out here and join us? It was a group of independent surgical assistants that shared an office staff, where the surgeons could call that office and ask for an assistant. And if they asked by name, you'd go. So I went out there, and did I learn a lot out there? Because I was coming from a small hospital. And it was funny because I had a pediatric neurosurgeon that kind of took a liking to me, and some orthopedic guys. And it was a real learning experience. But we also billed insurance. And back in those days, Colorado was kind of the mecca of surgical assisting. And with the surgical assisting came the reimbursements out there. And the hospitals would pay for Medicare and Medicaid. I think back then it was $35 an hour. And it was interesting because the guy that owned the Colorado surgical assistant was a guy named Al Sanchez. And Dan Bump, who was involved in, I think, ACE surgical assistants, he was on board there. And it was funny because he told me, he says, Fred, this was the most important thing he ever taught me. He says, you have to learn Surgeonese. And I go, what the hell is Surgeonese? He says, that's their own language. When you're at the scrub sink and you're with them, you want to make them feel comfortable and confident in you when you first meet them. So you got to learn how to speak Surgeonese. So he gave me examples, and I would go in cases with him, you know, and that was my number one thing I learned from him. But his skill level was very great, and he taught me a lot. So that was an invaluable lesson. And if I could pass that on to young independents or anybody that's new, you know, learn Surgeonese.
I love that. I love that
Great.
term.
Do you have an example of Surgeonese that you can give us?
You know, I would kind of talk to the staff in the room beforehand, you know, well, what's he like? What's he like? What's he doesn't like, or she doesn't like, or whatever, you know? So, the scrub sink, I'd say, well, hey, I heard you like this and that. And they'd get talking, and how about you? I said, well, I may not like that, but I like this. And they gave you a sort of repertoire with them, you know, where they could talk to you, feel comfortable. You talk to them, make them feel comfortable. It's the bottom line.
Gotcha. I know what you mean. Yep. You're right. That is the most important thing you can learn.
I say this a lot,
Kelly?
John, and you've heard me say it too. And I love that Fred gave that example and validated what what some of my advice has been to other first assistants as well. And that's just really, I call it sometimes reading the room, or just, like you said, knowing something, relating to the surgeon on some level or another. And the day and age that we live in, it's never been easier to do that. I was going to go to another area hospital recently and work, and I knew that who I was going to be working with. The charge nurse happened to text me his name, and I Googled him, and I read his bio on his website and found out where he went to school, where he did his training, and it mentioned what college football team he loved. And so when he came in the room and I saw his personality, and he was very outgoing and vivacious and, kidding around, and I was able to make a joke about his college football team favorite, and he just snapped his head and looked at me. He couldn't believe that I, had said that. But
Mm-hmm.
it is such great advice and just validates what I already felt was such an important aspect of our jobs, especially if you're traveling like John, or those first few cases that you do with a surgeon. It's kind of our responsibility, and I take that serious, to make that surgeon feel comfortable. And you have to break the ice somehow. Now, he's going to hopefully see my comfort level with the procedure and my skill set. But also, if you can kind of start relating to that surgeon as you begin the case, and it's going to help you to be able to even ask questions when you don't know maybe what to do. So, yeah, that's fantastic advice, and I'll have to remember that I'm speaking Surgeonese.
Mm-hmm.
I like that term.
That's right.
Yep. That's fantastic. That
And
always
he
helps
also
me.
said, you know, Fred, if a surgeon likes you and, you can be an average surgical assistant and he's
Mhm.
still going to use you, he likes you, he feels comfortable with you,
Mm-hmm.
and that, if he feel comfortable, man, that just puts the whole room at ease also, like he
Mm.
said.
Yep, that is true. Yep. They are responsible for that patient. They have to bear all the consequences and complications of that. And then you being a part of that, yes, to have that trust is fantastic. And
Mm.
I do the same thing. I didn't know it was called that, but usually when I get to an assignment, the other surgical assistants are really helpful because, they're understaffed. And I usually just ask, hey, what does he like? What does he not like? Can you give me any pointers with Dr. So-and-so? Oh, yes,
Yeah.
he loves this. He hates that. Don't do this. Don't do that. And it just helps make it, a much more easier procedure. But I was at one hospital and it was a robotic bariatric surgeon who was kind of gruff. And I did what Kelly did. I researched him. I found out that he had written a paper on postoperative pain management in bariatric patients. And we started talking at the scrub sink and I just said, hey, I read your paper. And he's like, you did what? You read my paper? You're probably one of the few that ever read it. And then that just started us out on a good foot, So I think a lot of that is just, good social engineering and knowing how
Yeah.
to, but if you're right, if a surgeon, likes you and trusts you, then, that's the key to the circle of trust in the operating room. But at what point did you ever move to Illinois? Because I thought the contracts you had sent me were for Illinois.
Yes, they were. Like, like I say, I was teaching with Colorado Surgical Assistant, and they offered I had to come out there as an independent. So I did. And back then, uh, you could get temporary privileges pretty easy at the facilities
Mm-hmm.
around Denver. And I had a sports medicine doc get me in up at Boulder. And lo and behold, I didn't even know because it was a female sports surgeon, which was rare back in those days. And she says, Fred, I got a patient in the ER. Could you go in and admit him for me? She goes, I know you got privileges. And I go, wow, I didn't know I had admitting privileges. She says, yeah, you do. But I mean, back then it was a whole different deal. But
That's true.
And so I went out there and stayed a couple of years. My wife's mother got real ill, so we had to move back here. And then it was, I think, 1993, and I took a travel position down to Riverside Regional down in Newport News, Virginia.
I worked there.
Yeah. Well, they didn't know what an SA was back then.
Yep.
They were using all surgical technology. So the first room I get called in to help was a vascular surgeon. Oh man, it was, I think, an axillary something down to the pop
Axiom,
pit,
yeah.
and it was a
Mhm.
mess. It was filleted wide open from within, and I'm going, wow. And he liked closure with a Keith needle, and I'm going, okay. But I stayed down there 6 months and came back, and then went out to Illinois.
Okay.
Hmm.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. And when you got to Illinois, there wasn't any licensure or anything at the time in Illinois, correct? You guys
There
were
was not.
You want to just tell us briefly how all that got started or how it was able to come to fruition? Because I know a lot of people ask that question about when is my state going to become licensed or when are we going to get licensure in my state?
I was working for a hospital group back then, and it was a separate kind of entity from the hospital. And back then, a guy had Midwest surgical assistants out of Schaumburg, Illinois. And he had people in 4 or 5 different states. This was the first time I'd actually seen or heard about anybody that had employed surgical assistants in more than the state that they were in. And there was myself, I went independent myself, Fernando Garza, Louis Aragon was involved in it, and Keith Sy was the owner of that. And I got a hold of a congressman that was very helpful. We got a lobbyist, that's still a lobbyist out there. And we started going in the process of doing it. Now, we spent a lot of money, the 3 of us, as individuals. And at that time, AST wasn't involved in any legislative efforts. But we got them involved slowly with it towards the end. We went to a lot of fundraisers. We spent a lot of time in front of people. So like if we went and saw the Secretary of State, he knew who we were. If we walked into a congressman's office, they knew who we were. And so it took time, and Governor Blagojevich at the time he signed our bill. And about 3 years later, he went to jail. But like I said, trying to sell a Senate seat. But it's interesting, in Illinois, they have T-shirts that say, in our state, governors make the license plates. Because they had like 3 of them that went to jail. But once that was passed, they called it a registration act, but you had a license, just like an RN had a license, a registered surgical assistant. You got your license, and I tried to be number 1 to get mine in, but I was late. I was number 8. But it renewed like the RN license every 2 years.
Okay.
And you had to go through all the stuff. But now I know they're pushing, AST is pushing, and some other people are pushing. But it looks like it might go through where you have to be a certified surgical technologist to work in the ORs.
Okay. You mentioned something there that I did not know. When you were pushing the legislation forward in Illinois, you guys used your own personal money?
Yes, we did.
Oh my God, Fred, thank you. I mean, that's something I never realized. And we're only where we are today because of people like you that sacrificed for
Right.
our profession. That's
Well,
amazing. I did not know that.
yeah,
Not
we
just
did
that,
it
John,
with
but not just
necessity
money,
too.
but his time. I mean, he said it took exposure. I mean, being in front of those
Oh, of
people
course.
over and over and over again. I mean, can you imagine just
hmm
how much time that took up? That's That's
Yep.
You
Well, we have
know,
the people that are doing that today that in each state that have pushed that forward. I'm grateful to every one of them that had known the legislative members and sacrificed their time to go there and sit on those legislative sessions, put on the mock operations, and constantly stay in the forefront of the memory of those people so that they know that this bill is coming up and to push it forward and to do what they can. And we're only where we are today because of people like that in each state, Virginia, Tennessee, Texas, all the states that have licensure. So I'm just really grateful. But I did not know that you not only, in addition to sacrificing your own time, that you actually used your own personal money. That blows my mind. Thank you, Fred.
well, you're welcome. We did a lot out of necessity because
Well,
Blue
sure.
Cross wouldn't pay us. We didn't get anything reimbursed from the hospitals for Medicare and Medicaid, you know. And
Right.
once you'd get a check, you'd go, "Woo," you know.
Yes.
We were very happy. But the Illinois Surgical Assistants Association actually sued Blue Cross. And they met us outside the courthouse and agreed to settle. and agreed to pay us, reimburse us. And you could
Oh,
be a network provider. And, you hear that today about the out of network and
Mm.
network, and the out of network I knew way back then was going to be uh, somewhere going to stop down the road, because of the monies they had to pay. And it turns out that we're no different than the surgeons out of network. They
Mhm.
would bill them high, astronomical fees, you know. And the same thing happened in the surgical assistant community around the country, And I don't think anybody doing a rotator cuff as a surgical assistant thinks $10,000 if you think you're worth $10,000 on the shoulder.
I agree.
And but the good thing about being in network was I had a sheet that they would email me with every CPT code,
Mm.
and I knew what I was going to get paid on each surgery, and it was usually there within a week.
Oh,
So
wow.
you may take a hit money wise, but you had consistent.
Yeah. Now, wasn't there, in addition to the legislation that you guys had passed in Illinois, wasn't there also a mandatory reimbursement law that you had passed, or am I confusing that with something else?
No, there was a mandatory reimbursement act that stated if the insurance company is going to reimburse the medical doctor for the procedure, they have to pay a non-MD surgical assistant for the procedure. And that's huge. I think that's the only
Yes.
one in the country.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's amazing. And it's a shame that the people that have come before us have also kind of hamstringed us by doing that. I had heard of some pretty egregious assisting fees that were actually paid like $35,000 to one surgical assistant. I mean, that just goes back to good business. You can shear a sheep once, but you can milk a cow all the time. So I don't know why. And also that has to do, I'm sure, with the insurance companies. They want to keep all that money anyway, so they don't want to pay anybody, let alone the surgeons or the hospital. So I guess
That's
it's just,
true. And if the surgeon kind of got wind of how much you got paid, that could create a problem upon itself.
yes. I remember there was a lecture at one of the ASA conferences about what to do if your surgeon finds out that you got reimbursed more than he did on that procedure. And but it's true. I mean, and the truth of it was, he said, "Well, doc, I can show you the stack of invoices that I'm not going to get paid on, which is this big, versus the stack of ones I get paid on, which is this big." So I think that's, a problem all around. But I know I had the idea that I would become independent and bill and be an independent private surgical assistant. However, that was quickly squashed by reality because it's
Yeah,
incredibly, I think, for people in your generation, it was a lot easier. But I think for people coming out of school now, it's incredibly difficult to establish yourself as an independent assistant unless you happen to be in a state like Illinois that has a mandatory reimbursement act or something such as that, or if you can get in a good position with the hospital where you can get paid for things you can't bill for. I know there's still assistants working independent. I have a friend of mine. I'm going to have dinner with him next week, I think. He's a surgical assistant. It's been one since about as long as you've been one, Fred, but here in Florida. So I think, but I think our profession's changing for the better. Kelly, you have any questions? I know
well,
I've been
yeah,
talking a lot.
I was going to ask Fred, back when the licensure and the registration was coming, into the forefront of the surgical assisting profession, was the primary purpose for that, was it strictly for reimbursement eligibility? And then also the second part, 'cause I'm
no
gonna
at the
let you, the
time.
second part to that is how has that changed now? Like, what is the difference between, for those of our listeners that don't know, what's the difference between being nationally board certified, registered, and licensed, and what role does it play in our profession now?
Back then, our main goal at the time was to promote patient safety.
Mm,
And it's very hard to include reimbursement either on a registration or a licensing act because the legislators are very suspicious when you put, well, we want to get paid, you know,
Hmm.
and that throws up a red flag to many of the sponsors and the legislative people. Safety was the number one thing that we went after, and they could understand that. And you could put it in terms and show them, you know, why we needed to be licensed or registered.
Mhm.
And in terms of the difference between licensing and registration, it depends on the state and how they went about it. Like in Illinois, we're registered, but we have a license. Now, in some states, you're registered and you just get like a number that you registered with the state, as you're registered. So somehow they look at it like you're not licensed, but you're registered. It means more than a certification. And I don't, Kentucky and Tennessee and, there are two different registration efforts there, and they mean two different things in two different states. Whereas I think Virginia's licensed now,
Mhm.
and it just varies. But what it does to the profession is it makes us recognizable as a true advanced practice provider, I like to call us.
Yes.
And that means everything in the profession. I think that educational wise, we're going to have to bump it up because all the PAs, the RNFAs, everybody's bumping up their educational requirement, even the physical therapist, everybody. So I think we're going to have to bump ours up probably to a minimum of a bachelor's degree. And that in itself rears up another problem of how do you get a bachelor's degree in surgical assisting and what are the requirements,
Yeah.
But for those out there that wonder, there's many states that just recognize you can get privileges. You can do that. I think such as in Florida, if you're certified, you can go ahead and get privileges and do that. But in Illinois, you can't work at a hospital unless you have your license. It's very rare and in between now that you can work at a hospital without a surgical assistant license. And if you're trying to get reimbursed from insurance companies, forget it. They won't reimburse you if you don't have a license. So
Yeah.
it's tough wherever you go. But also, years ago, Medicare had told us back when we were trying to get stuff with Medicare was you're going to have 26 states recognize you before we'll even talk to you.
Oh,
So that makes it tough.
yeah, it sure
Yeah.
does.
Yeah.
I started my career in Virginia when they were pushing for licensure and they actually got registration. And I remember I submitted for it right away. I got my stuff back and I was so happy. And then a year later, the Board of Medicine sent me a letter saying, how did you enjoy your first year of licensure? And I called them up. I'm like, wait, I'm not licensed. I'm just registered. And the person on the end of the phone said, well, we consider them the same thing. So some states, like you said, do consider registration as, as almost just like RNs always say, well, my license is on the line. You're not an LN, you're an RN. It's a de facto license, the way I understand it, just
Yeah.
like with the registration for the surgical assistant. So I think, yeah, that's definitely what I wanted to say about that. So,
Funny because now there's not a whole big push for Medicare because with the hospital's payments, an hourly rate from the Medicare, Medicaid, self-pays, some of those you're getting paid way more than you would be from a Medicare case,
mhm. Yep, that's
And
true.
I mean, some people have some god awful good contracts out there. And I know the bean counters were looking at it like if you're an independent or you have a surgical assistant company, you want probably 70% of your revenue from hospital contracts, 30% from insurance companies in order to be profitable nowadays.
Okay. That is, when you're talking about education and a pathway to licensure and things for our profession being a minimum of a bachelor's degree, I do find it kind of troublesome that a lot of these programs they've gone from a bachelor's degree to a master's degree. I personally just think it's a money grab so they can get you to get a student loan or a grant or something for that. Because I remember when you can become a PA with an associate's degree, and I don't begrudge EVMS. I think they're ahead of the curve by offering a master's level program, and the Mayo Clinic by offering a master's level program. But I did get the associate's degree in surgical assisting when Meridian offered it because I just wanted to keep moving forward. I was hoping they would offer a bachelor's, but you just laid it out. How do you get a bachelor's in surgical assisting? It's difficult. So, but I think as we keep moving forward as a profession, the licensure lends us legitimacy. People do look at us as professionals. And one thing I like that I'm seeing around the country, I know when you mentioned it when we were independent that you had to get privileges at a hospital. A lot more hospitals are credentialing surgical assistants through the medical staff rather than through HR like they do for a surgical tech. Or me as a traveler, even, they're requiring that we go through a credentialing process. I know when I worked independent in Georgia, I had to get on at 2 different hospitals, and it was an arduous process. One took 6 months, the other hospital took 10 days. But, I think it lends a lot of legitimacy to us that they verify everything and that they know the person that's operating on their patients. I think it just increases patient safety incredibly. So I'm glad
I
to see that
agree.
moving forward.
It does. I agree. I think we can all agree on that it lends itself, that process of
Mm-hmm.
credentialing, just like physicians go through and any other mid-level provider, does lend itself to the validity of our profession and what we're doing there as staff. But
Mm-hmm.
now we can go to the other end of the spectrum, and there are more states than not that don't recognize a registration or licensure for the first assistant. And I would like to, Fred, we can talk about how to educate the first assistants that are here that maybe are struggling in there. And this is a common subject that comes up online a lot in chat groups, talking about, educating our facility, our administrators and our managers about what a first assistant is, the training that we have, the extended education that we have, and so forth. And the $64,000 issue is separating us from the CST. So many of these hospitals, and you see this online, want to put that label on my badge that says CSTFA, and I'm just a first assistant. I'm just a surgical first assistant. They're delineating those roles has been very challenging for a lot of our colleagues. And I wondered if you could speak to that and how we can, at the grassroots level, start to make change in our facilities and go to our administrators and present an argument, if you will, to delineate us from that scrub role, and so that we can set ourselves apart and stand apart in our role.
Yeah, this is very important, because as you know, hospitals will get away as cheap as they can. And, that's a route where they can save money, say, but at what cost? The cost, the risk of a patient. At ASA, we have brochures that we'd love to send out to anybody that wants them. It goes, do you know who's assisting in your OR? And it breaks down, like the CST title, their job description from the Bureau of Labor, and everything, and what their standards are and what they should be doing, their practice standards, and the surgical assistant and what they should be doing. And it explains everything in very detail. And I've called up risk management. So I'll get some emails through the Surgical Association of Surgical Assistants, and I'll call up the risk manager and people and talk to them myself. And I will call OR directors myself and let them know. And some of them will call back. The risk managers are kind of open to it, but some are just so not bullheaded, but resistant to change, I should say. That's a better way to put it, because Well, it's working here. We haven't had any problems yet. But yeah, one lawsuit, you know, and and it's tough because the staff that's there, that's doing it, they said, "Wow, I enjoy it." You know, of course you're gonna love it, or
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't be in the OR. But you have to realize when you step up to that patient's side and the surgeon's across, you're taking a huge responsibility. And you have to look, never mind your ego. Ego has no part in that. When you step up there to assist, you're there for the patient, you know, and your ego has no place at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot of times I see a lot of problems. And, but I mean, they can feel free to reach out to me at, my email's out there, and you can get me at president@asa.org. And feel free. And any board member will definitely reach out and help send brochures, information,
Hmm.
whatever they need. But I know on the other things a dual, you know, and I
Mm-hmm.
am not 1987. I come in on an appy, nobody's there. I'm going to do it for the patient,
Mm-hmm.
not that it's right, but at that time, you know,
Right.
I agree.
Right. But it's tough, and it's just where we are in a lot of these hospitals. I noticed the other day I was filling out
Mm-hmm.
a risk management report on the computer, just the standard report that they have us fill out when any kind of incident out of the way happens, and it wasn't a huge deal. And I pulled up my name, it asked the name of the employee, and I'm putting in my name. And right there, when I pull up my name with my employee number, it says surgical technologist. And I was like, I'm not a surgical
Mm-hmm.
technologist. I mean, I don't know why they have that in there. And so I think, for me, maybe it's starting at human resources and say, "Hey, I noticed, my job title in the computer may be wrong," and just kind of starting from there. Obviously, you're exactly right, and you said a mouthful there, keeping our ego, putting our ego on the back shelf, because that's not what it's about. I want it to be accurate. I want to be represented
Mm-hmm.
accurately in the hospital system and to my coworkers, and I don't, want that to be wrong, but I have a feeling that's just they just lump us all in the same pool, and they're just kind of starting at our hospitals, just starting where to start and see about getting it, changed, and hopefully getting those two titles separated. Whether you know how to scrub or not, I mean, you can know how to scrub and set up a back table and, kind of get that done, but I'm not in that role. Therefore, I don't need to be identified as being that professional in the OR. Our CSTs are invaluable, and they have their place, and they have their role. And I just feel like that's where a lot of people are in wanting to create change. And I do feel like that's the start, maybe, of then progressing into being recognized as the mid-level provider, getting up to that level and being recognized, and as these registrations and licensures come about.
yeah, it's a tough thing. And I don't, people say, well, what about the CST/CSFA? You know, hospitals hiring for both, one person that's dual credentialed like that. And I don't foresee that going away because it's a way for hospitals to get, you know, bigger bang for their buck
Mm-hmm.
and say, hey, we got plenty of techs today, but we're slacking off on the systems, and if you're dual credentialed, then you can meet both needs. So I don't think that's going away, but I'd like to see the CST/FA definitely go away.
Go away. I mean, it's
Yeah, I was
and
gonna.
again, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, John. We say it a lot that if you're
Go
in,
ahead.
if you hold the CST credential and you hold the CSFA or CSA credential, and you want that represented on your identification badge, that's your prerogative. And I think all of your credentials should be on there if you want them to be. But the hospital, and I call it, it's just in their ignorance or their, it's easy. It's just easy to do it like that. They just lump us all in the same. And along the same line, I've met RNFAs that don't want to function in the circulator role. They consider themselves first assisting RNs, and they don't want to circulate. They don't want to dual role either for what they're doing. So we're not the only ones in that category there.
No, and it's funny with the turf battles, but once you step up to the table, but you're an RNFA, PA, whoever, you're all doing the same role.
Correct.
And provide that patient the best care that they can have.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons we started this podcast. And I was going to ask you, Fred, do you really know where that originally began, the CST/FA credential? Was that just something that the AST did initially? Or because, as a traveler, almost 99% of the job listings I see say surgical tech first assistant. And I'm like, there's no such thing as a surgical tech first assistant. The jobs are mutually exclusive. And you're talking about a role in the operating room. You're not talking about a profession. And a lot of times you can't even have this conversation because people get butt hurt and say, what's the matter? Are you ashamed of being a surgical tech that you don't want to scrub anymore? And I'm like, no, the jobs are completely different. I can't clamp, cut, or suture as a tech, and that's exactly my job as an assistant. So, something's got to change. I abandoned using the CSA, even though I have the CSFA certification. I just say I'm a CSA because there's no ambiguity with that. But even recruiters and travel companies are ignorant because they're like, well, all you guys can scrub. And I'm like, well, not really, because if you went through EVMS, you don't have to be a surgical tech to become a surgical first assistant. So a lot of them have never scrubbed before. So, but there's just a lot of ignorance in this. And that's one thing we hope to dispel by having this podcast, but also to help the profession grow. And I would like to see people recognize that these are two separate and distinct roles for a reason.
Yeah, I agree, ASA had listened to the membership and separated from AST. And, we're still hopefully in good negotiations about the continuing education credits and working on how to come to an agreement with the NB and AST on those. And this has been a long and arduous journey, kind of. But now, there's different people in the AST, then there's different people in the NSTSA. And, we got different board members. They have different board members. So, I'm very hopeful that we can sit down and come to some type of agreement that will work out for both memberships, ASA and AST, and it will work out. So I'm very hopeful for that.
Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful.
We are
because
too. Fred, what? I was going to jump in and ask a question. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I'm not against dual rolling. If you want to be a CST, and a certified first assistant, and you want to do both jobs, that's fine. But then the hospital needs to reimburse you for that. They need to pay you for that. Because if I'm not getting on a soapbox here, but if you look at the pays for an RNFA versus a CSFA for a traveler, it's completely different. RNFAs get paid a lot more. And when I question recruiters, they're like, well, they can circulate as well. That's why they get paid so much. I'm like, yeah, and I can scrub as well. But I don't scrub because you're not paying me for that. So that's just my little deal on that. That's all I got to say on that.
I agree.
Yeah, and that's a good
Kelly,
argument.
you were gonna say something?
That's a good argument for people to have. And so, and when that comes up, Fred, what would you say what are you most excited about for the future of the first assisting profession?
I think that, as the insurances are not reimbursing like they did, so you're going to see, I think, a lot less PAs in surgery because they can make more money in the office, make more money making rounds versus assisting in the OR. So that's going to open up, I believe, a great vacuum for surgical assistants to fill. And it might not be in a year or two, but I know it's going to be down the road. That's my own belief, but I do think that's what's going to happen. And I think there's going to be a huge growth spurt somewhere in the future for us. And we have to be prepared for it, you know. And you see
Right.
a lot of outsourcing, you know. I don't know if there's still a lot of big groups, you know, like American Surgical. And I know Lewis has Surgical Assistants, Inc. in Illinois. And there's some other ones out that are doing, you know. And the hospitals might be smart doing that too, but, you know, when you pay an employee, you know, 85, 100,000 a year plus benefits, you know, you can save a lot of money. But at the same time, there's both the pros and cons. You know? And Lewis has a good article on LinkedIn about that, you know.
Mm.
It's in the good read if you want.
I think I read that. It
But
is a
I
good
think our
article.
profession's going to grow in leaps and bounds.
Oh, that's
That's
great.
exciting. Yeah, that's good
Great.
to hear.
I'll have to find that article and link it in the description so people can read it. I haven't read it yet, but I'll look for it and see if I can find it.
Hmm.
So, or if Fred or if Kelly, if you can send it to me, that'd be great. And I'll
Yeah.
link
Yeah.
it in the description.
Hmm. Yeah. Well,
Fred, how would
yeah,
you
very
stress the
good.
importance of joining a membership organization like the ASA or the NSA is for our profession?
It's very, very important, you know. And people say, well, why do I have to pay 175 a year? Well, you look at all the things that, you know, ASA has done, you know, the Bureau of Labor, job descriptions, lobbyists. Yeah, I could go on and on. And that's what the membership fees do. Lobbyists typically cost about $65,000 a year. So if we're doing 3 states, you know, it's almost 200,000 a year. And that's
Oh.
a lot where the membership fees come in. And that's like a Starbucks a week, you know,
Hmm.
Mm.
if you break it down. It's not that much money. But they say, well, we still have to pay AST to get our CEUs. And you say, yeah, well, that's $80. So you're paying $255 a year. So that's a lot less than $1 a day. You know, so you're
Hmm.
paying 20 some bucks a month. And that, and you can be involved. Get involved with your profession. Don't just use your profession for your own personal gains. Get involved. This profession is making you a living. It's providing for you and your family, whoever, you know. You should be honored to be in the profession of surgical assistant. You know, this is a profession that this, you know, we're really the ultimate humility profession because, you know, the patient comes in, they leave, they have a great scar, and of course the surgeon's going to take credit for that one. But the patient doesn't realize, you know. So we are really, I'm sorry, I had some potato chips.
That's okay.
And it's membership is so valuable both in both organizations, you know.
Hmm.
We're working very well together now,
Yes.
and that's so important.
Fred, along those lines,
Well,
have we
especially
seen
after
an
what you just,
increase? And I'm sorry, John,
Yeah.
we have a delay if for those of you that are listening. So we're not talking over each other. There's some kind of delay going on here. So that's kind of messing us up. But I wanted to ask, yeah,
okay.
there is. I wanted to ask Fred real quick along those lines of membership. Are we seeing an increase? Has it been kind of stagnant recently? Is there an increase in membership with ASA specifically? Can you speak to that?
Decrease. We probably
Oh.
lost a third of our membership.
Really?
Yeah. And, And they say most common thing is the amount of money, the $175 and the 80. And before, when and we pay a management company also that does all the taxes, all the banking, all that. Well, none of the board members get paid at all in the ASA. Now, it used to be when we had a management contract with AST, $175, $50 went to the management company to AST. So that was a processing fee back then. And they would process the continuing education out of that fee. And that's part of what we're trying to kind of negotiate in with AST. And, that whole, somewhere in this fee, we want to include that will CEs be included with our membership fee. And that's one of the negotiating points we're working on, hopefully working on.
Right.
But yeah, the memberships have dropped down in our, but, and I think I would have to look. I would look on the things, but we're holding our own, seems like the last year. So, and we may be even up a few now.
We need to get a
which would be
campaign going.
encouraging.
We need to get a membership drive going.
Yep. This is true. Like we're giving away, if you're a new CSFA and you join ASA, your first year of membership is free. So hopefully that'll draw some people in.
Oh, definitely. That's
that's
fantastic. Every place I travel to as an assistant, I always talk to all of the FAs there, and are you a member of the ASA or the NSA, one of the membership bodies? And the second question I ask is, do you go to the conferences? And 90% of the people say no. And I it upsets me because I'm like, this is your profession. You need to join it. And then especially, yes, I understand there's a cost for these things, but it costs money to be a professional. Doctors join all these membership organizations as well. But to me, it's insignificant in light of what you had said earlier about they used your own money to push the legislation forward in Illinois. I'm not going to ask, but I'm sure that wasn't cheap.
No,
so,
well,
so $150, I'm a member of both organizations and I pay that, but I look at it as that's just the cost of being a professional,
I agree 100%.
Yeah. I'd like to get some,
Kelly,
like you mentioned, the brochures. Well, he mentioned the brochures that they have, describing what a first assistant is. I wonder if there's any, ASA membership. I mean, because I'm one out of 5 or 6 FAs at my facility, and I know I'm the only one that's a member. I know nobody else pays membership dues or goes to conferences, and I've let them know, the conference is coming up the end of April. I'm going to be going. But if we had even like I don't know, like a little, not a flyer, but like a little postcard thing, are you a member, like just with kind of a little slogan on there, a reminder to FAs that we could, put up at facilities. That might be something we need to consider.
I think we've got some. You want me to email you out a bunch?
Well, hey, I'm going to be at the conference.
That would be
I hope you have
fantastic.
some at the conference, but you could email them too, and we could print them out. That's for sure.
Okay. Conference is going to be, we'll have some nice surprises at conference.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, we are looking forward to it.
Yep, it'll be good.
But like you said, the cost of membership is one thing, but if you're a student, every membership has a student fee, and if I'm not mistaken, most conferences have a student fee as well, which is much more reduced because we understand you're in school. And I mean, I understand people have lives, they have expenses, they have families, they can't always travel to this, but this is, like you said, this is your profession. You have to give back to it. And what you get from it is so much more than what you give. Yes, it costs $275 to attend the conference, and it costs $175 a year to be a member. But what you get back from that is immeasurable, in my opinion, especially if you start getting into it and if you become involved. I'm grateful to you and Michael and Rebecca and Pam and everybody else that's on the board of directors, because I know that takes up a tremendous effort in your life and a lot of time. But we wouldn't be where we are today if it wasn't for people like you. And I just wanted to say that I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful that you were willing to come on this podcast and talk about that.
Well, thank you guys for asking. And it is invaluable. I think, in the fall, we have the virtual conference, which is a lot cheaper. You stay home, log on, eat some breakfast, do whatever, have lunch and stuff. And we're trying to come up with different options, and we're actually looking into the live streaming of the conference. But the audio visual cost that the hotels want is just out of this world. Yeah, you'd be surprised. Well, we want $10,000. You're going, are you nuts? No thanks.
Yeah. Right. Well, does that wrap it up? We've kept him for a little over an hour now.
Let me
We've
just look over
gotten some
my
good-
questions. Yeah, let me see if
Yeah.
I do have one question for you though, Fred. What piece of advice would you give today to a brand new first assistant that's just graduating and just starting their profession? Knowing what you know now, what you've seen, and what you think the future is going to hold for surgical assisting, what would you tell that brand new graduate that's just starting their career tomorrow?
I would say review your anatomy, because if you know your anatomy, you're way ahead of the game. If the surgeon asks you to say, well, hey, do you think that's a cystic duct or the bile duct or whatever, know your anatomy. 2, if you go into a case, be honest with the surgeon. If they say, well, how many of these you've done? Don't lie and say, well, I've done quite a few. If you haven't done any, say, no, I've never had, but I'm looking forward to it and working with you and you teaching. And the other thing is have a notepad so that you can write down what you think your strengths were during the case and what you thought your weaknesses were. And I would ask the surgeon, how can I improve my skill level on this surgery? And usually the surgeons will be very honest with you and say, well, you might want to work on this or this or that. Do that. And also write down what that surgeon likes and dislikes. So you're ahead of the game. And the lap chole, here's what he likes to do. He doesn't like this grasper. He likes this other one. So you look like, you're interested in the surgery. Don't go in there half-cocked. Don't go in there looking arrogant. You know everything. And don't act shitty to the staff. It's the nicest way I can say it.
Great advice.
The staff can either help you or not help you, and it's important that you have a good, I guess, how I say, a good understanding between the staff and yourself. They'll respect you, you'll respect them. Don't talk down to the staff. And, just be a good human being and be the best surgical assistant you can be. And don't walk in there thinking you know everything just because you went through school.
It's great advice.
And learn Surgeonese.
Surgeonese.
I like that.
That's right. Surgeonese 101. That's
That's
right.
it. Wow.
All right.
I don't
Well,
think there's
thank you
any better
again,
way to end a
Fred, for your
podcast than
time.
with that sage advice.
Yeah.
No,
Yes.
thank you guys. And thank you for what you're doing to promote our profession. This is very important. And thank you guys for taking your time and effort to do this.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes,
We just
yeah.
wanted something there was no resources like this for surgical assistants. So we're like, well,
Yep.
let's start one and see where it goes. So hopefully people are getting something out of it. So
Well,
hopefully
I
it'll
heard
grow.
good things. So all good
that's-
things.
Well, that's great.
That's good. That's
Wonderful.
good. That makes us
Well,
happy
thank-
when we get
thank
good
you, Fred. I
feedback
appreciate
and
that.
positive feedback.
Yeah, you have a nice weekend.
Thank you so much. You too.
Thank you for joining us today. We invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast. Feel free to look us up on Facebook at The Surgical Assistant Podcast. If you like, you can also email us at thesurgicalassistantpodcast@gmail.com. We look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Content of this podcast is created for surgical assistants and is educational only. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, or offer medical advice on surgical conditions. No patient-specific information is shared, and all HIPAA guidelines will be adhered to.